and religion. How deep does the connection go? Some see him as a savior, almost a modern-day prophet. Others call him the antichrist. His supporters include religious groups that believe he is a part of God's plan for America. Meanwhile, critics warn that faith is being used as a political tool. To break it all down, we're joined by Dr. Mark Meynell, a British writer, church leader, and teacher who has worked in many countries worldwide, including several teaching trips to Ukraine. Dr. Meynell,
good morning.
It's a pleasure to have you here in our studio.
Thank you.
Yeah, and straight to the point, some religious leaders compare Trump to a modern Cyrus or draw parallels to King David. Where do these notions originate? Are they merely political, or is there a deeper significance?
Well, there have always been people who have identified themselves with certain characters in the Bible, going back to the Old Testament as well as the New. One of the reasons for this is that in the Old Testament, you see the history of Israel being very much a political history. And so the story of a king rescuing his people from enemies is right at the heart of it. And then, of course, this is the background to the New Testament, and Jesus comes as the King of the Jews, as well as the King of Kings. And so inevitably, when Jesus is alive, there are people saying, are you going to do what David did? Are you going to be the person who will rescue us from the Roman Empire? And he says, well, my kingdom is not of this world. But you've got that entire sort of legacy of Israel's history leading to, well, now 2,000 years of Christian history that people can pick and choose from. And I think that's what's going on here in the States and in other parts of the world. People are picking and choosing things that seem to fit with the political agenda that they have.
Yeah, we will come back to Israel actually in a few moments. But you know what's interesting? Many evangelicals believe Trump is divinely chosen despite certain aspects of his life that may not align with Christian values at all. Is there support reflect a shift in American Christianity?
I think you're absolutely right. There has been a shift. It's very interesting. If you compare polling done when Clinton was president with what's going on now over the last 10 years or so, it's fascinating how when Clinton was president, people in churches in the States were very concerned about the personal lifestyle and ethics of the presidency. But now, when they've got somebody who's supposedly on their side, well, they're quite happy to turn a blind eye to that. So it's convenient to say, oh, well, no, that doesn't really matter. And I think that there's a lot of sort of special pleading going on here, a deliberate rejection of some of the values that they held to before. And I think it comes down to pragmatism and political expediency. They think he's our guy, he's the one who's going to defend us, and so we'll defend him, whatever he does. And they'll excuse everything that he does as, oh, well, that's just Donald Trump. But that's really inconsistent. And I think particularly from Europe, where we're looking, and I'm sitting here in the United Kingdom, we look at that and just, well, we're just speechless, really. It seems such a shift and completely hypocritical.
Yeah, Mr. Meynell, I just looked how many books you have behind your back. This is amazing. Yes, but what was your personal reaction when Trump some few years ago said that he was saying that a few times that he's the chosen one? How church should react on such a statements from politicians?
I think it's a dangerous statement. I mean, I think one of the things about reading God's hand in human history is that most of the time, if we can do it at all, it can only be done backwards. We can only do it in retrospect and say, oh, okay, in all the chaos of that historical moment, God was at work and this was just the right thing that was needed. But at the time, most people do not have a clue. And it's always risky for somebody to declare themselves to have this kind of role, because basically what's going on there is a means to justify any action they want to take. In other words, if I am God's man, then you must do what I say because it's what God wants. And that is incredibly dangerous. And I don't think there is any grounds for that. There's no foundation for doing anything quite like that in the Bible. And certainly, if you apply it to church leadership, there are a lot of places that seem to suggest that leadership needs to be plural in order to prevent precisely that kind of megalomania.
Oh my God, this is something crazy is going on. And the Bible
really
reference a leader who holds power for 3.5 years while Trump's first term lasted nearly 4 years. Are individuals interpreting the Bible to rationalize his presidency right now? Or is this purely coincidental? Yes.
Here's an interesting thing. In 2,000 years of church history, every single generation has identified itself in the Bible, and in particular, the book of Revelation. So that's where the 3.5 years idea comes from. And every generation has said, this is us. The end is about to happen. Well, here we are 2,000 years on. The end hasn't happened yet. And I think it just illustrates the danger of trying to interpret your Bible with a newspaper in your hand and saying, this is that. And that's very, very risky. And it has led people up all kinds of blind alleys. And more than that, sometimes into very dangerous and life-threatening situations. And so I think, for example, the numbers in the book of Revelation, there are loads of numbers that are symbolic. And you have to understand how they function in that book. You can't just pluck it out and say, isn't it funny? Here he is. He's been in the White House for 3.5 years. Oh, that must be what Revelation is talking about. That's just nonsense. It doesn't work like that.
But what signs give us, what actions and testimony can give us a sign that Trump is not the chosen one, but quite opposite, like Antichrist or something?
Again, you see, the Antichrist label has been used in every generation in church history. And it's people who seem to be aligned against what God is doing in the world. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that when you see in the New Testament Jesus at work in Judea, and then at some of the sort of points in church history where there's been real growth, that growth comes because of looking after the people that the world has forgotten, looking after the people who are at the bottom of the pile or on the margins. And that seems to be one of the consistent acid tests for a character and an ethic that comes from God's kingdom. So that's an interesting acid test, isn't it? Because basically what seems to be happening, and I understand that politics is always much more complex than you get in the media, but what seems to be happening is a focus now in American policy on the wealthy, the powerful, and interacting only with other wealthy, powerful, whether it be states, corporations, individuals. And that does not seem consistent with Christian kingdom ethics. It's very, very clear to see. And I think that was something that, that extraordinary moment that was at the day after the inauguration, in the National Cathedral, the bishop there speaking about precisely this point. She was onto something there, that basically there is a responsibility, if you have power, to use it for the sake of, for the protection of those without. And so I think that applies to the situation in going on in Ukraine at the moment, isn't it? I mean, basically, you've got a country that was invaded through no fault of its own, no desire, certainly. I mean, there's no conceivable way in which Ukraine started this war. And the bully on the street, if you like, the bully on the block comes in with all its tanks, expects to conquer it in 3 days. And that's why so many countries around the world, but particularly in the West, said, no, well, this is not on. It's basically the big guy picking on the little guy. And that's why we want to support it. So Trump seems to have completely turned that upside down.
Yes, yeah, that was my next question about that one closely. During the Capitol riot, it was in 2021, some participants portrayed Trump as engaging in a biblical battle. Are religious ideologies being employed to justify acts of violence? That's what you said previously. What are the potential dangers of this? What are bigger dangers behind this?
Well, it all derives from assuming as your first principle that you are acting on God's behalf. That is an incredibly dangerous starting point, isn't it? Because basically you can justify to yourself and to supporters any action you want to take. Say, well, okay, this may be horrible, but this is God's will. And it is a very clever way of preventing any questions or opposition. And that, in a mature political system, is something always to be avoided. This is one of the whole reasons for people wanting to be more democratic as opposed to totalitarian, because basically they wanted a voice. Now, democracies are much more chaotic. The trains don't necessarily run on time, but people have a voice. They are not silenced or marginalized. And I think that's why, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that are worse.
You're right, Mr. Meynell, but at the same time, still people becoming quite blind when someone so powerful as Donald Trump saying that they are chosen by God. That's a tricky moment. They love freedom, but at the same time, they can be fooled by, some person who's definitely not from,
right,
not from God, I would say. Yeah, so...
well, yes, indeed.
But, can that provide a new form of religious extremism, not only in the United States, but to have a wave on other countries?
Yes, definitely. And, as I say, history has seen this happen again and again. The situation in the West since 1945 and in the east of Europe since 1990, these have been very unusual in global history, haven't they? Basically, this kind of, not just a sort of uneasy peace, but an intentional, deliberate attempt to try and ensure that there is dialogue, that there is interaction, that there is cooperation, as in terms of, as opposed to just competing like in the school playground. That is very, very unusual. And it's not something that is inevitable. So, we may be on the verge of losing it. That's a frightening thought. But I think one of the things that's gone wrong in North America, particularly in the United States, is people have been fixated on just one or two policies. So I think one of the things, probably from the 1980s onwards, has been the big question of abortion. And there are many ethical questions about it, and there are aspects of abortion that are definitely and truly terrible. But there are also all kinds of social and welfare questions that people seem to ignore, but they are related and part of the debate. But by focusing just on that issue, probably to the exclusion of everything else, basically it comes down to, when I vote, I'm only going to vote on the basis of who is going to do the more conservative position on abortion. And it was interesting, that's how George W. Bush, part of his strategists' work was to say, okay, we can bring the evangelicals on, mainly because George W. himself is an evangelical, but also because they said, look, we will fly the flag against abortion, and people will then vote for us, and then they'll ignore some of the other stuff because they say they've won this issue. The irony is that in the 8 years Bush was in the White House, Bush 2, he didn't do anything on abortion. He didn't touch it. And so that's one of the reasons why Trump could come along and say, no, well, I am going to do something about this. And people think, oh, okay, so that's the issue that matters. And so they're going to vote for him. And I think we're now seeing the cost of that, the legacy of that, is that basically people think, okay, well, therefore Trump is right, whatever he does. He gave us anti-abortion. He got rid of Roe v. Wade, which was the legislation that prevented abortion, prevented banning abortion, and he got rid of that. So he's our guy, and we'll go with him wherever he leads. But it's almost getting to the point of feeling cultic. It's a bit like, well, he's the Messiah. We'll go wherever he goes, and that must be dangerous. Certainly in a democratic situation, but in any situation.
Okay, so historically, leaders perceived as messianic figures have brought a lot of negative changes, I would say, as far as I understood you, right? So, but from your perspective, Mr. Meynell, as a church leader, what positive changes that can bring to the country, for instance, to the United States?
Well, I've been to the States many times, and I have many good friends, I love it as a country. It's not my country. I'm very nervous of saying what I think could and should happen there. But there's no question that I think for many people who have kind of been apathetic about politics, I think already we're seeing in just the first 2 months of this year, people actually being very sort of fired up, and you know, the more people get involved in public life, the better, really. That's how democracy works. It makes things harder for those in charge, but that's the whole point. So I think that's got to be a good thing. I think it's making Christians decide, or it's beginning to. I think, you know, it's early days, but it's forcing people in the end to decide, is it more important to me that I'm Christian or that I put America first? I mean, that's what it comes down to. And in the end, I think those are convergent paths. I think being on a Christian road and American first, those two might start in a similar position, but they lead in very different directions. And so I think it's forcing believers to say, I can't hold these two together.
But
now, whether or not that works its way out into the realities of church life will remain to be seen, but that's the choice.
Yeah, but Mr. Meynell, is that possible to go to this one path, combining that I'm a good Christian, you know, I'm a believer, but still I'm, you know, working on the this concept of America, you know, great again?
Well, there are people touting so-called Christian nationalism as a big thing, and there are conferences now and so on. So there's definitely a sort of a wave, and you've seen this at various points in all over the world. You've seen this in my country, in Britain. I think, you know, towards the end of the 19th century, the idea that the British Empire was God's means for saving the world. There were people who thought that. So there are uncanny parallels, I think, sometimes in the history of empires with what's going on in the States now. But I don't think nationalism and being a Christian in the end are compatible, because basically the Christian message and the church is for all nations, languages, and tribes. And that basically I now see somebody maybe from an, in quotes, enemy country who is a believer in Jesus. I must see that person as a sister or a brother over and above their nationality. So God's kingdom must transcend all human divisions. In particular, it must transcend nationality and ethnicity. And so the very idea that there is a way of saying, I am a Christian, therefore America first, to me, both as a Christian and as a European, seems just faintly, well, it's just impossible. I just don't think that is compatible. And in the end, I think what happens is that nationalism always wins. It always overcomes the Christian bit, so that it becomes more and more nationalist and less Christian.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. Yeah, and you know, I wanted to ask you, recently Marco Rubio appeared on Fox News with an ash cross on his forehead,
right,
observing Ash Wednesday, practice symbolizing. commencement of Lent in the Catholic tradition.
Yes.
This public display of faith by a high-ranking official is uncommon, right? What was your first reaction when you saw it? I mean, what side of that?
I mean, I think that's fine. I mean, there's, I don't want to say he can't do that. I think with politicians, particularly because of our media age, everybody's very focused on the image and, the soundbite. So I'm sure part of the calculation is to say, oh, well, people will look at this and say, isn't he devout? And I'm not disputing that. I'm not questioning that. But it suits the agenda, doesn't it? I'd be much more interested if somebody who was a genuine believer but had views that were more opposed to their denomination or whatever, doing that. That would be quite an interesting thing. But here what you've got is somebody who is part of an administration that is clearly using a Christian, a form of Christian belief and heritage in order to push a particular and, let's say, very narrow position politically. That, to my mind, is very unhelpful. It looks as though it is exploiting it. Now, as I say, I'm not going to question Secretary Rubio's personal devotion, because I can't know that of anybody, let alone somebody on TV. I'm just a little disconcerted by the fact that this is just part of a bigger trend of using whether it's the Bible and publishing a Bible with your name on, the Trump Bible. That by itself is deeply questionable. It's just all part and parcel. But here's the really interesting thing. So in the UK, we have no separation of church and state. I'm a minister in the Church of England, the state church. And yet Britain now is one of the most secular countries in the world. So we have no separation. And our head of state, the King, is head of every single part of British life, the government, the prison service, the military, the church, you name it. He's at the top of it all. In the States, they have a massive focus, and they have done since the revolution, a massive focus on separating church and state, because they want to say, look, you can believe what you like, but the state will not have an official religion. But here's the weird thing. You have this separation, but there hasn't been a serious candidate for president who's an atheist, whereas we've had countless prime ministers who are atheists in Britain. It's like there, they have to say we are separate, but they have to pretend to have faith if they have none in order to get voted. And this is the logical extreme of that. This is saying, well, we're going to, I would say, pretend to have all kinds of Christian values and beliefs in order to get voted. But this is our agenda. And then we're just going to cover it in a kind of Christian veneer, a covering. So it looks Christian. There's some Christian language you can use to describe it, but it's still the far right agenda against immigrants, to be isolationist or whatever it might be. And I think that is incredibly dangerous, because it's basically, at its very heart, it's a deceit.
Oh, wow. When I've been to the United States for the first time, it maybe was 8 years ago. And it was just a program where I was supposed to write some articles. And I wrote the article about something that I just observing in the United States. And I was in Minnesota, and I wrote the article which calls "In God We Trust" and questioning Mark.
Right.
Well, I was surprised by the number of amazing, beautiful churches and about their emptiness. No one there on Sunday Mass. That was quite interesting. So now when something is, when I see what's happening in the United States, I'm like, where did they come from with all these religious ideas? So I'm not judging, I'm just saying that for me it's something.
Yes. I think, though, what I'd say to that is that, in a sense, the States is not united. There are probably 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9 key sort of major blocks or demographic blocks. And in the South, it would be a very different situation. And I think there's no question that a lot of the base for Christian nationalism does come from the South, but it's not exclusive to the south. But there are other patches, particularly on the coasts, I would imagine, and some other areas where churches are empty and people turning to alternatives, whether it's sort of Eastern religions or Islam or whatever it is. So it's very difficult to generalize. But I think what is fascinating is that strategists in the Republican Party have clearly used religion very effectively to build their base, and it's worked, certainly up until now. How long it's sustainable, well, who knows what's going to happen, but it's so complicated, which is why, the idea that say, California would support what Trump is doing is just out of the question. They're just, many people are horrified.
No, I'm sorry. Keep going. I'm just agree with you.
No. I think that's all I need to say on that, probably.
Yeah, and I want to go back to the Israel question one more. The Trump's decision to relocate the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem has been seen by some as a biblical end time prophecies. Do you think it's a speculation? Or it has some weight? It has some weight behind it?
It certainly has a theological stream behind it, so it's not completely out of the blue. Okay. It fits with a certain type of reading of the New Testament, particularly the book of Revelation. And it sees, the foundation of Israel after the Second World War as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, I think there are all kinds of historical, political, ethical reasons why Israel was founded. The circumstances it was founded, there were alternatives, but that's what happened after the war. I don't quite see that as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy about Israel, because I think the meaning of the word Israel in the Bible is actually quite fluid, and it's not always clear exactly what Israel is being referred to there. But here's the big thing. I mean, one of the reasons why people, particularly in North America, but elsewhere too, see Israel as so significant is because they are looking to events to herald Jesus's return. And they're thinking that everything is just making it get that little bit closer. These things in place it's bound to happen in our lifetime. Well, the fascinating thing is in the New Testament, and it's from the lips of Jesus himself, he says, nobody knows the time. Nobody knows the dates. Now, for sure, we're getting closer just because of the passing of time. Mm-hmm. But I think he's warning us not to try and speculate. Not to try and calculate the date, because he says not even he knows the date. And yet it's just amazing to me how generation after generation is full of some people who spend all their time, with their calculators and their calendars and their Bibles, trying to say, well, is this the day? Is this the day? And then people say, it's coming on January the 14th or whatever it is. And then when January the 14th comes, he says, I got it slightly wrong. Maybe it's March the 2nd. And it's just absurd. It's like, but Jesus said at the beginning, nobody knows. It's just one of those sort of little verses of Jesus, I think, that is most honored in its disobedience. He's saying you don't know, and yet people keep saying we know. So the moving of the embassy was, to pander to a whole constituency who were behind Trump in the sort of Bible Belt in the southern United States, because they see, this will just bring about the end. I just don't see that in the Bible, and I certainly don't think that's the significance. And I think what's going on in the Middle East is far too complicated for just a sort of very simplistic wave of the wand to make something happen. I think that's incredibly dangerous, and I think we've seen the results.
I wish a lot of people would think as you are, and analyzing situation like you do, and I wanted just to make a shift to Ukraine and, in times of Russian war in Ukraine, another crisis. How does the Bible assist individuals and, in understanding current events? What role does faith play during this challenging period, and especially for Ukrainians?
That's so important, and I guess for a lot of people, certainly many Ukrainian friends I'm in touch with, and since the invasion 3 years ago, I've been in touch by social media or whatever, probably at least every week, if not daily, from the beginning. And this is right at the heart of it. How do we understand it? How do we interact with it? There are a lot of things to say. I think, in essence, Christian theologians over the last 2,000 years have tried to distill how to interact with questions of war, because Jesus said there will be wars and rumors of wars, and basically that is human history. History is full of wars. So that is a reality, and this has just brought it into very sharp focus, hasn't it? To say, okay, we've got to think about this now. And the way Christian theologians have distilled it is to bring together some thoughts in what's called just war theory. And it involves two main areas, both how do you act in the lead up to war or when a war begins? And then secondly, how do you act in the process, in the conduct of the war? Now, in the lead up to war, what's very interesting is that, to my mind, and I'm not an expert, and I'm certainly not a military expert, but this was an unprecedented attack. Well, it began, didn't it, in 2014, after Maidan and Crimea, that basically suddenly out of the blue, Crimea is annexed. And it's like, oh, okay, so what's going to happen now? And the world still didn't quite want to believe, did they? I think this is part of the problem. Didn't quite want to believe that there was a bigger agenda behind the annexation of Crimea. So people quickly just came to terms with it and said, oh, well, it was always part of Russia or whatever. And just said, well, we must just go along with this and hope that actually nothing else happens. But of course, that was utterly naive, and the world has been proven to have been naive, if not deliberately trying to avoid thinking about these things. But when the invasion began, after all the stuff going on in the Donbass and all of that, I mean, so, it's not gone away. But basically, the invasion comes, and it's very hard. In fact, I think it's impossible to explain the invasion by just war theory. There's no real grounds. There might be historical grounds, sort of. But the way I explain it is, well, okay, so the Republic of Ireland has been independent from the United Kingdom for 100 years now. It was part of the UK for several centuries before that. So, invading Ukraine would be like London saying, right, we are going to take back Dublin. And, even though for many years it was part of the United Kingdom, the fact that it hasn't been for this time should be enough. And that's why the rest of the world will condemn an invasion of Ireland. I don't think, incidentally, that's what should happen or will happen. But that's a parallel. So when Russia invades Ukraine, that is a major transition. And I think that's why people have really stepped up, and why some, not all, have supported Ukraine in its self-defense, because self-defense is one of the key aspects of just war theory. It is the just and right thing to do to defend your country if you have the means. I mean, if you do not have the means, then the ethics are harder. But if you do have the means, you have a legitimate authority saying this is what we're going to do, and it's proportional to the invasion, then that is right. And in fact, it is appropriate for a Christian to do that. So there are Christians who are pacifists, of course, and they would reject all of that. But there is a strong tradition of saying, no, it is right to defend when you're attacked. And I think, therefore, and you can see sort of examples of that in the Bible, of people doing that. So I think it's entirely legitimate, and that's why Christians I know have signed up and gone to the front, and friends of people that I know have lost their lives because of it. I was in Kyiv just in October, and just walking around, seeing all the flags and the memorials in Maidan and elsewhere. It's very, very powerful. These were people who said, no, it is not right for our country to be invaded. and we will defend it. And I think that is a consistent Christian position. I cannot do the other, say the same for the invasion. They are not equal.
You know, I'm a Greek Catholic, and I remember the beginning of full-scale invasion in 2022. I went to church for confession, and I said to my priest that I hate Russians so much. I felt so much anger and hate and such a lot of negative emotions that were quite justifiable, of course. And I said it to him, like, is it okay that I hate them so much, that I want them to die? And he said, listen, we should kill them with love. And that was something that I could not realize and understand, because I said, but can I hate them? And he said, well, we haven't decided yet here. So I think he was trying to cheer me up somehow, because lots of people were desperate.
Did it work?
Yeah, but I was,
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we can hate the policy, we can hate the orders. We have to love our enemies, but that does not mean we do not defend ourselves and fight them. And there are many stories, say from the First World War in the trenches, or even after the war, when veterans meet and they were on either side of the same front line shooting at each other, but actually they found after the war is finished they had more in common because of the horrors of their experience as very young men, maybe only 19 years old, that actually they bonded with the guy on the other side. I think that the difficulty is our attitude to those in power. I think that's a really difficult thing. I think we need to love them in the sense of praying for them, but that does not mean we love what they're doing and we love their position. So I do pray for those in power to see the horror and error of their ways and maybe to lose power. I think that's entirely legitimate, and that there can be reconciliation. But I'm not naive about that. I've been in Ukraine and sat through air raids, and that was the first experience of my life. I mean, how privileged are we in the West that haven't had to do this for decades? But it was very sort of salutary to be there. So, I have a small sense of the terror and fear each night. We pray for reconciliation in the end only on the basis of truth.
Yes.
And accepting what's happened. I think, after apartheid in South Africa, one of the most extraordinary things, South Africa is a complicated place, and I've been there a few times, and I love people from there. And there were lots of things have gone wrong in the last 30 odd years. But one of the things that was astonishing, and I think it was a witness for the world, was their Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the end of minority white rule, to say that there could only be amnesty if you confessed everything. And even then, it was not guaranteed. And they had people on all sides. There were terrorists from the whites, there were terrorists from the blacks, and it only worked if people told the truth. Now, that's really, really challenging, especially in the current political climate on both sides of the Atlantic, where truth is just not valued. Truth is an irrelevance for a lot of leaders. So you can have President Trump one day saying Ukraine started the war, and then 2 days later, or whenever it was, saying, oh, did I say that? That's an odd thing to say. I don't remember saying that. And it's just like, what's going on? Well, what's going on is that he knows what he's doing. It's just that truth is not a category that matters to him. It's just the moment. And of course, that leads to chaos and nobody knowing what's happening next. That's very frightening. But that's part of the strategy, actually. Whereas we have to find ways both to stand for truth, tell the truth, but also recover the truth. One of the things that I found most alarming in the last, few years is that group Memorial in Russia being closed down, whereas they had been working so hard to recover the stories of people who died under Stalin and so on, and, you know, right up to the present day. Closing that down, I think, was very significant. It's saying, we don't care about truth, we don't care about history, we don't care about why we're here, it's just that we're in power now. That's basically the Kremlin line. We're in power, we want to stay in power, it doesn't matter what you think. Truth is just a tool. Well, and then as soon as that happens, it's not truth, because truth is usually inconvenient. Yes. And I think in Ukraine, I think this is important. I think it's a challenge. Hopefully the war will end very soon. There's got to be truth about how Ukraine has operated the war. There'll be some things that actually are deeply shaming. There always are. I mean, that's the thing about war, isn't it? Nobody wins in war. Everybody loses and everybody does terrible things. There has to be truth, however uncomfortable, because that's the only base on which to build a functioning, healthy society. But, you know, whether that will happen or not, who is anybody's guess.
Yeah, I think that we should fight with Russian propaganda and lies only with truth and facts. You know, Mr. Meynell, yes. I really hope that with the help of God, with the help of Ukrainian army and our international allies, we will end up this war quite soon. I really hope.
Well, we pray for that. We really do.
Thank you. And unfortunately, our time, we have to round up. But I'm really, thank you so much for this very deep, interesting conversation. I hope that a lot of people will see it. Dr. Mark Meynell, a British writer, church leader, and teacher, was with us on Channel 24.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was wonderful. It was super, super nice. And I hope that we will speak with you maybe in some few months. I will just see what's happening elsewhere, especially in the United States. And probably we may speak about something like Russian churches and what's happening with the religion there, if you would like. What do you think?
Anytime. I'm very happy to. And I'm hoping to be in Kyiv. Are you based in Kyiv or Lviv?
Yeah. No. We are in Kyiv, yes.
I'm hoping to come in maybe June. I haven't quite worked out the dates yet, but anyway, so...
Yeah, actually we may do that in the studio somehow. It's not necessary to have it via Zoom or Skype. It's also easy to arrange offline. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's been a privilege.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, have a nice day.
When will this be live?
I think it's going to be quite soon, because at this channel, everything is happening so fast. I think today or tomorrow, not later.